Now, I'm not gone yet. We could have gone into the same topic. In fact, I think it was a great setup for my friend and former colleague Brian Fung, who's the fantastic technology reporter of the Washington Post, who's going to be guiding a panel through the topic, the future of work, too much disruption or not enough. Come on up, Brian. And following him, we have Dean Garfield, super cool dude, President and CEO of the Information Technology Industry Association, Liz Simon, Kristin Sharp, Executive Director of Shift at New America, and Liz Simon, General Counsel and Vice President of External Affairs at General Assembly. It's all yours, Brian.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate that introduction. Thanks to our amazing panel today for coming out, and I think we're going to have a great discussion about the future of work, which I'm sure you all know is a really exciting and distressing subject for a lot of people. I thought maybe we would start just with a big open-ended question. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing workers today, and what are you personally doing to address it?
Should I start?
Sure, go ahead.
I think one of the biggest challenges is acquiring the competencies and the skills to be successful in today's world. And 2 data points, I think, captures that, which is we've got over 7 million people who are unemployed in the country today, 2 million of those who are long-term unemployed. At the same time, we're at a record high in the number of open positions in the country. We have almost 5.7 million open positions. And so that challenge of acquiring the skills, getting the competencies necessary to fill those open roles is a major challenge that our companies are committed to working to address.
Similarly, I think that one of the major areas is needing to figure out better ways to identify the growth areas, both in artificial intelligence and technologies and sort of innovations and technologies that are coming, and how people will apply and use those technologies going forward. Right now, we have a little bit of a mismatch between the jobs that may be changing as a result of automation or new technologies and what we're trying to get people into. What are the new options and new emerging potential areas of growth? So I think that's probably the biggest problem to start with.
Yeah, I would agree with both Kristin and Dean. I mean, I think at General Assembly, we spend our days working on, equipping people with these skills to really prepare them for, the jobs as they're changing, as technology continues to change our work. And so, I mean, some of the biggest gaps we see is that, as you said, employers, have, these, open jobs and they don't have the folks to fill them. And they're not able to sort of predict long-term labor market, where those jobs are going, what jobs they're going to need. And so, they've got, on one hand, we've got people who are sort of long-term unemployed or underemployed, and we've got people who are desperately looking for talent, especially in technology roles. So we're doing our work every day to sort of bridge those gaps, working directly with companies and individuals to train them up in fields that are going to help them on a path to economic prosperity.
Yeah, I mean, for example, if I can just build on that
Please.
Very quickly, if we know that coding is as fundamental to the future as Spanish is, why isn't coding offered in every school that Spanish is, right? And General Assembly is working to address that. But as a nation, I think a fundamental question we have to ask ourselves is, what will it take to be great? And if we're not doing those things, then we should.
And I would just quickly add also, beyond coding, which today, right, it's huge, there's a huge demand, but we know the average shelf life of skills is about 5 years, and so what is it going to be beyond that, and how are we thinking ahead, so that our education system really evolves to allow for those types of changes, and also workers kind of develop a mentality that allows them to think about their career over time and lifelong learning as a part of what we all have to do to stay relevant.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is, beyond coding, it seems like every day you see exhortations from schools and policymakers that you really ought to learn how to code. And we are teaching a lot of people, like former coworkers, how to code in Kentucky and whatnot. But is there some kind of an upper limit to that? I mean, once you start to, what comes after coding, as you sort of imply?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I know there's still tremendous demand and it's projected to increase for web developers in the coming sort of 5 to 10 years. But, one of the things that we see companies investing in, if not as much as, or if not more so, than is data roles. That's another sort of really hot area that I'm sure everyone hears a lot about, but, data analytics, data science, we see companies, investing large scale to make sure all of their organization has fundamental capabilities around those types of disciplines. Cybersecurity is another one, DevOps. I mean, those are some of the things that we see companies coming to us really looking for at a large scale.
And what kinds of skills sort of feed into those professional tracks, right? It's not just learning how to produce code, right? There's a certain kind of worldview or mentality or thought process that goes into creating that kind of position.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the way we think about it is there's a combination of sort of technical skills as well as kind of soft skills that go around it, right? As, all workplaces, employers are demanding people who can, work in teams, and, that's part of sort of learning to code is not learning one particular language that you might use on the job, but also learning how to think about continuous learning, as you're always going to have to be, as technology changes, learning new things, and that's consistent in a lot of the disciplines we teach. So employers are looking for people who are going to be able to be lifelong learners, and that's one thing we hear over and over within companies is that they need people who can be adaptable and continue to evolve.
I think that's a really key point, that we need a mentality shift from sort of this one and done model where you study something in high school or college and then that carries you through and you build on that for the entirety of your career. And we need to get into a mentality where rather than one specific skill of coding or graphic design or whatever the thing is, sort of a sense of entrepreneurialism so that people are working to identify new opportunities in what they're doing in their current company or in sort of a related field, but something that makes a jump. I mean, it's this sense of how do I find and motivate the next thing that I'm going to do that we need to get to as an economy.
Is the U.S. education system set up for that type of learning? And if not, what can we do to fix it?
Hell no. And I don't know is the answer number 2. I think one of the things we need to do is exactly what we're talking about, which is to recognize that it's not a one and done model, and then 2, to create that bridge and connectivity between the supply and demand side, as we say in Washington, but really between the workforce and employers. And so I've seen the stat about 30% of the skills you acquire will become irrelevant every 3 years. And so there's this continual need to learn new skills. One of the things that we're learning in tech is that we can't just talk about particular jobs and job titles such as web designer or coders, but really get down to the competencies and the skills that are necessary to be successful, and to make sure that we're actually sharing that with institutions of higher learning, so they're integrating that within their curriculum.
A few years ago, Tim Cook got on 60 Minutes and he said, he kind of lamented the decline of vocational training in the United States, and that if he would hire all kinds of high-skilled manufacturing workers if he could in the United States, but they just don't exist here. At the same time, the numbers still consistently show that people who have 4-year college degrees earn more or out-earn their peers who lack those degrees. So how do we figure out that contradiction?
I mean, I think it's a balance, right? I don't think we're going to be in a world where the college degree is not like one of the most, if not the most important signal to employers of what people can do. I mean, today that's really, for better or for worse, the best signal that employers have to really, think when they think about sort of how they hire and recruit. So I think we're a long ways away from the sort of college degree being irrelevant when it comes to hiring. But, I think, the way we evolved, the way General Assembly evolved is kind of like a vocational training program, almost as a replacement to grad school for folks who largely already had a college degree, who were looking to, at some point mid-career, learn additional skills, and they wanted to do it quickly and, for less money than, going to a traditional, graduate school program. And so I think we've got to think really creatively about, what are these sort of, shorter-term, accelerated, programs that can get folks into the workplace. What is the role of employers versus what is the role of government in doing this and funding this? How can employers, I think it's one thing to say, higher ed should connect more directly with the sort of, demand side. But I think that's really hard to do in practice. There are certainly examples of it working well, but it's really hard to do. And so there's going to continue to be, a range of sort of innovations happening around this, especially at the sort of outside of the traditional, higher ed system.
I do think, though, that some of that can and should be industry-led. That, I mean, I've heard from a number of larger companies recently saying that just the step of putting a section on their online application models asking what are your other credentials, or do you have other credentials beyond college, sort of gets people thinking about that and gets people thinking about what are other ways that they can acquire skills. And I was at another conference recently where somebody said that about 15% of applicants do list that now, even without being asked for it. So that's one interesting thing. And then the other sort of track of that is companies who are saying, we're not going to require a college degree as a baseline entry-level job anymore. We're going to start thinking about, what kinds of skills we really need and how to encourage people to come in and try to get those skills in any way that they can.
And some companies are doing it on their own and disrupting the educational system. There are a number of companies that have moved to a model of 6-year education where they're actually taking kids beyond the 4 years of high school, doing 2 years of extra training, whether with you or someone else, and then providing a fellowship or an internship or entrepreneur opportunity, and then hiring a lot of those people, but also putting them out in the workforce. And there are lots of examples of that. I ran into one of the folks from Cognizant walking in here. I know IBM is doing it. I know Oracle. There are tons of our companies that are experimenting with those types of programs. And I think it's a recognition of the fact that we live in a dynamic world, and so our education system also has to be dynamic, and I mean that in the full sense of dynamism, in that it is awesome, but also truly flexible, and will shift over time.
Kristin, you guys just published a report recently on the future of work, and in particular looking at automation. Can you walk us through some of the most interesting findings from that?
Yeah, so the Shift Commission on Work, Workers, and Technology spent the last year going to different cities around the country to brainstorm with people what they think the future of work will look like 20 years from now as a result of automation, artificial intelligence, other technological and innovation changes that are happening right now. And we found a couple of really interesting things, many of which we've already talked about today. One, that people will have to really much more carefully go after the kinds of things that they want to do, find the opportunities that they want, seek them out, seek out the training for those things, and that we're headed towards a more independent and sort of self-motivated workforce, for better or worse. Two, and the potential downside of that, or the thing that we at least need to keep in mind, is that most people, when focus grouped, surveyed, talked to in informal discussions, say that the number one thing that they want in a job is stability. They want to be paid on the 1st and the 15th of every month, and they want to be able to forward plan for their families. And so we really need to think about, as a country and as an economy, how to balance those two things so that we're empowering people to take risks and take on new challenges while providing some sense that they're not going to fall through the cracks. So I think that was a really interesting thing. And another thing, really, and the sort of single biggest thing that we came away with was that every single problem and every single challenge or opportunity that we think we have in 20 years is actually happening now. Yeah. We're at the pivot point right now where we have to think about, as a sort of collective group and country, what skills we want to encourage for people, what new pathways and sort of approaches to how to get ahead in a job, how to advance in a job, how to create a career or a work situation that has the potential to go forward.
Did you sorry to ask
no,
questions,
please.
Yeah.
But did you can leave now. Did
you can do my job for me.
Not at all, not as well as you're doing it, obviously. But I'm curious about mobility, because over the last 20 years or so, we've seen a significant decline in people's willingness to move for work. And I wonder if you have some sense of, through your work, what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I think that there's I mean, a significant portion, something like, I don't remember the stat offhand, but like something like 65% of Americans live within 18 miles of their mother right now. And that's,
That's probably the answer there.
that there is sort of a sense that people are creating fewer new businesses and wanting to create fewer risks. And that's a real contradiction in the economy, where the opportunities have been in independent work, contingent work. That's been sort of the growth area in the economy in the last 15 years or so, while at the same time people are not willing to move for various reasons. Family reasons, the community-based reasons. One thing that we saw repeatedly and over in every city that we went to was how important a sense of community was in a job. Both, either you go there and meet with and talk to the people, or it's a community of people that work in that industry, sort of that's one of the things that we'll need to create new avenues for finding community if more and more work becomes independently directed.
So far we've talked a lot about how technology has created all of these new challenges for us. I wonder a little bit, to what extent technology can help solve some of these problems in their own right.
Well, I mean, I think, to the point we were just talking about, which is, people are increasingly sort of localized, right? So how do you think about, getting, those people equipped with the skills they need to be successful in their own career paths? And so, maybe it doesn't make sense for General Assembly to have, a physical location in, Kentucky, but, there are people who can learn online, and that technology enables, people to be able to learn new skills on their own time, on demand, in all kinds of new ways through GA or, anyone else that's offering, sort of educational offerings to them that will further their career. So, I mean, I think, innovations in the way we learn, and the way we can access skills, and innovation in the way we can do work, right? I'm sure you've done studies about sort of, people who are doing remote work opportunities, gig economy type stuff that's more remote and contract based. Like, I don't know how much of that there is, but, people sort of doing things on like an Elance Odesk type opportunity. But, I think a lot of sort of this is going to come down to, and this is not technology, which is, where are the jobs in those communities? And, I don't know how technology really, it's going to create new jobs. And I think as technology, the jobs will change, but hopefully it's going to be about creating the jobs on the ground in those communities.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I have two big buckets that come to mind. So one is all of the new industries that are created that we didn't anticipate. Mm-hmm. So 10 years ago, when Al Gore was inventing the internet and commercializing it, the idea that we would have, as a result of it, 90% of the data that's being created in the world been created in the last 2 years, and wholly new industries that would spin from that is just not something that we would have anticipated. And so I think there will be work that will be created as a result of that, and there is the potential for technology to be a part of the solution in rethinking how we educate and train people for those jobs. I think the challenge for us will be a human challenge, which is what it's been historically. Technology is really just a platform for overcoming human limitations. At the center of that are us and our ability and willingness to lead. Dr. Tyson just made the point that all of the members of Congress that you've had today have fundamentally agreed on exactly what needs to be done to make this country great. I would say 90% of those things won't happen. Why? It really comes back to us and our willingness to see what's happening and to do something about it. And so hopefully we will. We're committed to, I think one of the evolutions that I've seen from the 60 companies that I work with, we've traditionally been reluctant in the technology sector to talk about our innovation while we're innovating, and also a willingness to talk about the challenges. So to talk about the implications of trade and the role that we may be playing, or the implications of AI and the role that we may play. I think increasingly we realize that we're not only thinking about these issues, which we long have, but we need to talk about them and collaborate with other people in defining and coming up and acting on solutions.
Yeah,
I
that's a
think
great point.
that's a really interesting point, though, because I don't know that we're necessarily unwilling to talk about it. It's just that we're unable to talk about it. People, as new technologies and avenues for jobs are emerging. People don't always have the words for what they are.
absolutely.
You know, nobody knew that an app designer was going to be a thing 10 years ago, and
What
that's
is
a
the gig
job.
economy?
Right. And so I think as we're in this moment of new jobs emerging as a result of various technology platforms that enable new things or enable people to take new chances or whatever it is, like we'll have to really think about the narratives of how you describe those opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to add one quick area where we're really bullish on technology actually sort of changing things for workers is, you know, around the sort of, we're hearing all this talk around skill-based assessments, you know, and companies using technology at scale to really assess people's skills and competencies versus relying on those sort of markers like a college degree or otherwise that they would traditionally do. And, you know, I think that's going to be something we see even more of. As companies are, one, having a hard time, you know, finding the talent they need, looking to diversify their talent pipelines, and, you know, increasingly dealing with sort of inputs that make less and less sense, and so really focusing on who can really do the job, which I think helps people broadly.
So I want to make sure that I leave enough time for audience questions, and generally what I do is, you know, I'll open it up to questions, but pose a few other questions while you guys are thinking of things to ask to the panelists. So you know, there are mics around, and I'm sure by this point you guys know the drill. But first, I wanted to come back to something that Liz and Dean, you had just touched on, sort of the role that companies can play in retraining workers. And Liz, I know you and I had talked a little bit earlier about what some companies are doing to invest in their workforce. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening in the industry there?
Yeah, one of the things that we're seeing really over the last sort of 9 to 12 months or so is that companies are starting to make really large-scale investments in really radically reskilling parts of their organization. So, for example, taking, you know, people whose jobs may be becoming obsolete and/or potentially, you know, folks who'd be laid off, and reskilling them. These are loyal workers who are, you know, been at the company, who have aptitude and capabilities, and they're being, you know, trained up through GA to, you know, move into a tech role, learn data science skills, learn web development skills, and companies are actually making the investment to say, you know, it's worth it for us to pay you to go through a 3-month or 6-month full-time training program so that we can redeploy you in a different way. And that's really something that we hadn't seen before a year or so ago. And so I think there's a lot of reasons why that's happening. You know, for example, you know, we're doing a project with Capital One today where, you know, we're taking folks who they're hiring out of college as liberal arts grads who don't have any tech background, putting them through a 6-month full-time, you know, tech training program, and actually putting them, essentially doing their onboarding and putting them into tech roles, and that's what they've been hired as. But that's because Capital One is saying, we need these roles at scale. We don't know where to find these people. We know how to find talent. We know how to identify sort of aptitude. Let's find these people and train them up. And so I think we'll continue to see companies playing a bigger role in sort of innovating in this space and, you know, funding reskilling programs, thinking about retraining, thinking about lifelong learning. If they're going to continue to evolve as every organization is kind of going through their own version of digital transformation and becoming a tech company, I just think we'll see a lot more and more things like this.
Yeah. The only thing incredibly well articulated, human beings are the sustaining force of our companies. And so the only way we'll have a future is if we have people who can carry those companies forward and continue to innovate. And so I think there's a growing recognition that relying on random quantumness to solve for the challenge that we're facing as a society is not good enough, given the political dynamic that's also suboptimal at the moment. Washington talk for it sucks. And so we need to do more on our own in the interim until those problems are solved for.
Mm-hmm. Let's go ahead and take a question from the side first. Do we have?
We had a line a second ago.
The
What
line
happened?
just disappeared.
Oh, they took the mics, that's why.
So there's been a lot of discussion in this one on the lack of workforce mobility in the United States. And my question is, to what extent does our system of state and local To what extent does the system of state and local occupational licensing in America contribute to this lack of mobility? So currently about a quarter of the workforce is licensed by local and state government, which is up more than 500% since World War II. And you can make an argument that it has a huge impact on mobility because they're not transferable often over city or state lines. And just to take real estate, to move your house today, you pay often a 6% broker's fee and often a 2% recordation and transfer. That's 8% on $1 million house. That's $80,000 for no social value. Incredibly inefficient system borne by the power of one occupational license. But you could say that about many, cosmetology, architecture, you name it. Why isn't this part of the discussion? Isn't that a huge factor? The Obama administration had a committee to look at this, but they didn't do anything. It seems like a politically impossible issue. There's no mileage in it for anybody to address. Can you imagine that congressman who was talking about this, addressing this issue at a local or state level? I can't imagine he would get anything out of it or anybody else. So
Okay, so the question's about occupational licensing.
You may have just answered the question.
it's an important issue.
I mean, so, you know, today GA doesn't really do any work that's sort of in the field of where there's sort of proprietary licensure or anything like that. But, you know, I think one of the interesting things that we think a lot about and we get asked a lot about is, you know, what about GA for healthcare or advanced manufacturing or, you know, does the model of sort of these accelerated training programs that, you know, are really closely linked to workforce outcomes, can they be applied in other sectors of the economy? And the answer is absolutely. We'd love to do this in an area like healthcare, but there's obviously a ton more regulation around, you know, fields like that for nursing and everything around that. So, I mean, I think, you know, does that create some barriers? Sure. And are there ways that that should probably evolve? Yes. I think, you know, we should really ask ourselves where the sort of job growth is happening. Like, is it in cosmetology? I don't know. You know, is it largely happening outside of some of those occupational, you know, fields that are kind of controlled by certain, you know, occupational licensing, you know, bodies or whatever? I mean, perhaps. And, you know, I would say it's certainly something that, you know, we've got to look at as part of the whole picture of, you know, how the workforce is changing and, you know, how we need to give people the flexibility and mobility to move around.
Yeah, maybe a bank shot that's less controversial for a member of Congress is, so the Department of Labor every month publishes data on the unemployment rate and hence the unemployment rate. But it doesn't publish data on unfilled jobs. And so maybe if we got, whether it's Department of Labor or the Department of Commerce, to publish every month the open jobs, the hottest jobs, in time, maybe you can then draw a link to say those jobs that are the hottest and the fastest growing jobs should have complete portability. Mm-hmm. And so we need to limit any hindrance to portability. And so for all the reasons you articulated, there is likely to be objection at the state and local level and at the congressional level to making the change that you're talking about. But there may be other steps that we can take in the intermediate term that would get us part of the way there and then ultimately all the way there.
Mm-hmm. Let's take another question from the audience. How about over here in the front?
Thank you. My name is Claudia Bellania-Tanga, and I'm a local economist from Charles County. Really enjoyed this panel. EIG recently published a report about the millennial economy. There's been some discussion on how they're risk averse and not really jumping into the entrepreneurial market, where 75% believe that the biggest hurdle to starting a business is student loan debt. And 50% believe that that is the lifeline of our economy is entrepreneurship. So what are we doing to encourage and kind of lift the barriers of student loan debt so that more young people, more millennials, can start entrepreneurial businesses and ventures? What are some of your comments on that? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great question, and it's one that comes up again and again when people are talking about, you know, why they don't see steps forward for themselves in the economy. And I think that using technology and thinking through ways to just think through both first options in addition to or other than straight borrowing for college degrees is one thing, but also thinking about ways to invest in individuals, and think about crowdsourcing models, think about investments in people who want to go forward, think about using technology for reputational rankings in order to allow people to use different financing models and things like that are options. But I will say that we found that a big reason that people don't want to take entrepreneurial steps is because they feel like they don't have that option with debt.
Yeah, one of the things that we are doing a lot of sort of experimentation with right now is income share agreements. So for folks who are coming into a General Assembly program, many of whom, as I mentioned, already have college degrees and happen to be saddled with a lot of debt already and can't afford to take on more debt and or don't have good credit to be able to take a loan, pay for this out of pocket. They don't have friends and family who can help them. And so the income share model is certainly one where that's really ripe for sort of a policy discussion. It's kind of uncharted territory, but the model is essentially students pay nothing up front. Investors are essentially subsidizing them to go through a training program, and their obligation is to pay back a portion of their salary over time once they get a job. And so there's downside protection. If they don't get a job, they're not on the hook to pay anything. And there's caps. So if you get a really awesome job, you're not penalized by paying a ton more. And you can look at experiments at Purdue University. I mean, they're the first sort of major undergraduate, four-year institution that's doing, a pilot around this, which has produced some interesting results so far. It's obviously a lot more intuitive in a short program like ours, where the ROI and the sort of connection of a job is a lot faster than a four-year undergraduate degree program. But I think that's an area we'll see a lot of sort of continued innovation around.
Yeah, I would say healthcare and education are the two areas that have been least disrupted by technology, but that won't continue to be the case. I also see our companies doing a lot of innovating and experimenting around similar type of program. And so for today's student, it's a huge challenge and will continue to be a challenge for the country for some time. But I'm optimistic about the future because of all the experimentation that's happening in that space.
I also think,
Great.
One quick thing I'll add on that too is just the role of employers in funding some of this training versus the government. I think that's a question that we're talking about a lot.
Yeah.
So.
Let's go back there.
Whatever Steve says.
Yes, so I think I'll take that question maybe to a next level in a sense. My name is Rubin Pasha. I'm the founder of my eDream incubator in Iraqi Kurdistan. So, thinking of a lot of the factors that you talked about and some of the enabling environments of how do you get up an ecosystem and a mindset shift to some of these disruptions that are happening, and how we enable the next 20 years with some of the questions we're facing now, i.e. the next generation, to be really ready for that next wave of the economy. In this day and age, and clearly in 20 years even more so, what's happening around the globe is going to affect the United States even more. And in places like the rest of the world, in place where I work and where I went back after being a diaspora here to establish an incubator in a conflict zone in Iraq, 30% of the youth are unemployed. More than 2/3 of the populations are under 30. So there's huge amount of potential of what disruption in job creation can do, because most people don't even have the jobs. And what that means in a lot of places around the world.
Short form.
Yeah. Is how can we, so my question to you is, how can we consider some of those ways of even small level investments in ecosystem and mindset enabling around the globe would be conducive to building that and the entrepreneurship in the next generation of job development, but B, how to make the policy perspective of how this affects and is in the best interest of the United States to do so. Thank you.
You want to take that?
Yeah, I think you are absolutely right in your analysis, and the benefit of global growth here as well. I think that this is an incredibly difficult political moment for those investments. And it has real and meaningful manifestations. To be as specific as possible, many of our companies are thinking about anew where they invest capital and putting greater emphasis on the United States, because many of the problems that exist in Iraq and other parts of the world also exist here. And because of the emphasis on doing right at home, there is a real desire to figure out if that's feasible. It's unlikely that you're going to see a rush to invest in other markets, particularly where there are compelling reasons to invest here right now.
I want to ask a quick question about other kind of biases in the system. Some of you may know Jim McKelvey, who with Jack Dorsey created the company called Square. He was a glass blower. He wanted to sell some glass he did to Brazil, and there was no way to do it, so he created that little credit card swipe company down there. His next avocation is actually called Launch Code, and trying to train people who've had some issue in their life. Maybe they went to get trained in coding and whatnot, had a they came out, but they weren't as qualified as they might have been. They might have a health issue that's been difficult. They might have had a speed bump in their career one way or another, or in their private life one way or another. And he has created this academy to code people, to teach people this. And the thing he
All right,
learned.
keep it short, Steve.
What's that? No, this is my party. So I think the issue is in that case, his problem was helping these people get jobs. That we pretend that jobs are just open. But human resource departments weren't hiring them. They weren't taking risks on these people who could code phenomenally, but they may have been in prison or may have had some health issue that they thought might get in the way. And so when we think about disruption and actually changing it, what he had to disrupt was not what was going on there, but HR departments who were notoriously bad at taking risks, giving people second chances. And so he began using his celebrity status to call people like John Chambers of Cisco and say, you know, your HR department sucks and is not hiring these kinds of people who were more skilled than anyone else who would come in. And so I'm interested in those kinds of blockages, whether you see them in the system when we talk about whether there's disruption enough or more. We talk about it in a way that there's a lot of dead wood in there that kind of continues to pretend that talent has to have come from the right school, never had a blemish in their life. And so I'm interested in sort of second chance economy stuff and whether we can get down to really the merit of someone's skills and making a difference and kind of crunching some of these biases out of the system.
Yeah. Do you want to go take that one first?
That's a great point. And one of the main trends that we've seen at Shift over and over is that there's a lot of innovation, or at least more innovation in companies within their own workforces than there is in trying to get new people into the pipeline. So I think one thing that needs to happen is that there need to be new companies, new systems, new approaches to recruit and make sure that people sort of have the baseline soft skills and the baseline, sort of basic computer literacy skills to go from there and get those people into the pipelines. But I think too, like just being aware of what's in the algorithms, particularly at large companies, they screen out lots of people in lots of ways. And so being very cognizant of that and asking that companies lead the way by reevaluating their own algorithms and asking specifically who they're screening out and how to be more inclusive about getting new candidates in is crucial and something that doesn't need government or federal policy to happen. It just needs companies to decide to take that step to evaluate it.
Yeah, this is an area we spend a ton of time in, and there's often a huge disconnect between what's going on in the HR department versus what the hiring managers are looking for. And that's why I mentioned skills-based assessments as something that's really, really critical to the future, that technology will sort of enable a more merit-based view of candidates' abilities and competencies, right? We're investing a ton in doing assessments, working with organizations like Launch Code, like Code 2040, that are really focused on helping companies build diverse talent pipelines, taking those biases out of the hiring process, and getting these assessments in the hands of as many companies as are willing to use them. But it's an uphill battle. I mean, we're doing a program right now with Adobe where they're funding folks on scholarship to take them on as apprentices, and they're this is increasing by 30% the diversity of their tech teams. But it's hand-to-hand combat. It's like each person is sort of and they're gathering the data, and one bad experience can turn people off. And so you've really got to this is an organizational shift within companies. One of the examples I like to point to is there's even a lot of government cities and stuff, they're doing tech talent pipelines and sort of focusing on New York as an example. They're focused on, how equipping New Yorkers with these tech skills and, funding programs through GA and other programs to get them tech skills. And, the city themselves doesn't hire anyone without, the right sort of degree credentials. And so we've really got to, think broadly about how we eliminate some of these biases.
Yeah, I think when you talk about bias, you bring in conversations about race and gender and inequities, and people immediately become defensive. Like, no one wants to talk about race. It's just like icky, right? But I could go down a rabbit's hole on that, but I won't. But when you talk about skills and competencies, which in many respects will manifest the same result, then people are more comfortable with it. And so that's one of the things that I'm encouraged by, is this focus on competencies, micro-credentialing, all of the innovation that you see in this space, I think will have inclusive benefits as well, which are absolutely necessary.
So one of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately has been, about automation and how obviously it's going to lead to some job displacement, but for other industries it may lead to a wage premium. So, think jobs like nursing or home health care, those, that require a large degree of, a personal touch might suddenly get more expensive. And my question is, in a world of increasing inequality, when everything that involves a personal touch is suddenly 20% more expensive, what happens to people who are minorities or are in low-income situations who can't access those services? What happens to those people?
Yeah, I think what happens is, sorry to come back to this, but it's actually what I think. What happens is dependent upon us. So one of the things that I'm encouraged by is that as we are developing AI systems, and we talk about it as artificial but also augmented because it's contemplated as helping human beings, we're thinking about all of these questions, but also trying to figure out ways of addressing them. And so not leaving it to randomness, but actually driving by design what the implications are. We're obviously not going to be able to help everyone to afford it, but are there things that we can do to make it more equitable so that society at large, and certainly communities of color or rural areas, which are also being left out, are also the beneficiaries of these innovations?
Anything to add, you guys?
So be intentional, I guess, is the ultimate.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think we've got to continually be thinking about how to make sure that folks who've been left out of the system, who face barriers to education or economic opportunity, have access to training opportunities to get into those types of careers that are really that we're seeing a demand for, as that are sort of these hybrid roles that incorporate sort of human and technical elements, because that the one way to ensure people can continue to sort of afford what's going to happen if prices are increasing and services are changing is ensuring folks have good jobs that are paying them a decent living wage.
One of the things that we somewhat unexpectedly uncovered in Shift was that there's a big population and a growing population of people who have elder care responsibilities as a result of the aging baby boomer population. And that part wasn't unexpected, it was, but the connection between people's opportunity costs of scaling back their work, taking different jobs than they would have taken as a result of having elder care responsibilities, and the ways that it affected and interplayed into the workforce was something that we didn't expect as much. And so, thinking creatively about how to, as we go forward and have more and more people who have those responsibilities, how to accommodate or subsidize or think through people who are spending their time taking care of their own relatives, either facilitating that in some way or paying people for that, or at least thinking about how to allow people to provide care in their homes for their family members when they're doing it anyway, if they're giving up some participation in the labor market for having done that. I think we'll at least need to talk about that at some point.
Let's think about the Atlantic and the print media business, which today is, I think, some 40% smaller than it was 10 years ago, right? There were lots of people 10 years ago who were predicting that shift, but not a ton of leadership around, well, what is the implication of that? What do we need to do to prepare for that, manage for that? Similarly with manufacturing, right, since 2000. I think the thing that we can do differently now is to learn lessons from that, exercise some leadership, and make sure that we're prepared as a society to deal with those changes, including what you were just talking about.
We've got a few more minutes, so let's take some more questions.
Steve handed me the microphone, so I guess I get the next
looks like there's
question.
already a mic back there.
This is his party, right?
The impact of Steve.
I'm Ken Jarbo with the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And we've done a number of studies on training and workforce and all that sort of thing. I get very nervous when I hear the word pipeline applied to the workforce as opposed to the word pathways, because pipeline connotates a very narrow path. There's only one way. You go to the best schools, you get the best jobs, you go off, retire, et cetera, as opposed to the multiple pathways that you're talking about. So I would encourage you to change the rhetoric a little bit. And my question is actually to Kirsten about the training. I'm glad to hear that a lot more companies are doing training, because there used to be a problem where they would do none. I mean, it was easier just to hire somebody fresh and get rid of your old workforce. But what do the small and medium-sized guys do that are still caught in the free rider problem?
Sorry.
It's a good question, and I think an important one, because large, traditional, existing corporations have the funding for a recruiting and training budget and an education budget and things like that, whereas we hear a lot that small and medium-sized businesses in small and medium-sized cities don't have the ability to fund a training program to find the next 15 people that they're going to hire and pay them for a year while they're doing it. So that's a real and legitimate question. I think some of the things that need to happen are identifying in small and medium-sized areas and sort of diverse geographic locations what kinds of things would they like to see happen in order to get new people into a pathway for hiring, and then what are the stumbling blocks that they're seeing in their communities, because it's different for every community. So those solutions a lot of times have to come from the community level.
Yeah, I would say this is an area where bringing the supply and demand side closer together in regional communities is critically important. I would also say what's the role of sort of policy and government here? I'm thinking about investing in the demand side. I mean, how would you incentivize small and medium-sized businesses? What sorts of incentives might be useful for them to be able to make those kind of investments that they otherwise might not be able to make? I mean, I don't know if there are things today. I know there are lots of sort of hard and archaic kind of workforce training programs that companies that are small can tap into. How do we think about modernizing those for the way that work is changing, things like that.
Okay, we've got a very patient gentleman down here who has a question as well.
While the mic is yeah, sure.
We can hear you.
We can repeat the question if.
Well, while the mic is coming, the thing that I'll share is our companies are working on the issue without expecting to hire everyone that we train, which will redound to the benefit of smaller communities as well. But it is a broader societal issue that we have to figure out how to address.
For Steve's sake, I'll try to be fast. Robert Schroeder, International Investor. I think some big elephants in the room are being ignored here. Algorithms. I wonder if ageism could be part of that algorithm process that's been eliminating a lot of workers. But if I'm a computer parts warehouse, and I've got shareholders breathing down my neck because our competitors are offering more shareholder value, why in the world would I hire American young IT workers when I can get some that will operate for 1/3 the wages for an H-1B visa? Why would I have my order processing done here when I can offshore it for about 1/5 of the wages? Why would I have the workers in the warehouse hired here when they can only work 8 hours a day and I can afford a robot or automated processing that does it 24 hours a day with no unions, no complaints, no sick days? You know, I really think if you really want to look at the future here, we just completed a series called The End of Jobs, and we're much more pessimistic than any of you.
Yeah, so I have an answer to a couple of your questions. One is that I think increasingly companies are looking at shareholder value more broadly than they have historically. And then two, and you can look at any of our companies that are driving the NASDAQ right now and see that, and see it clearly in the investment that they're making. Two is, as we move to a world with augmented intelligence and technological innovation, labor cost is no longer the sole or decisive driver in where we locate. And so companies are increasingly making the decision to locate here in the United States because it makes sense as a rational economic matter, but it also makes sense on delivering shareholder value, where the brand implications are also grand, which is a part of the consideration of shareholder value. So all of the conversations that you hear about rethinking investment are not fiction. They're truly real. I hear it all the time and I see it. And you can see it in the investment decisions that people are making.
Yeah, it's definitely consistent with what we've been seeing from companies that we work with in the last, 9 to 12 months as well, which is, really increased investments in their domestic workforce here, in job creation, and then investing in those people. So, is that consistent across the board? I'm sure not. Are some of them more exceptions in the rule? Maybe, and we're just sort of finding the people who are most sort of forward thinking on this. But that's not something we saw even a year, 2 years ago.
Yeah, and that is not to suggest that there aren't implications to the world that we're heading into, and that there aren't pivotal decisions that we have to make in order to make sure this is managed properly. Managed doesn't give credit to the unpredictability of innovation, but I think if we bring the same creativity and rigor and discipline that we bring to our innovation to trying to address the implications, that we'll have success, and that's why I'm optimistic.
So we're about out of time, but thanks for everyone for joining us on this panel, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
A big thank you to Brian, Dean, Kristin, and Liz. Thanks, guys.